This is the Angry Birds Bird Minute, sponsored by Angry Birds for their 15th anniversary, where we tell you all about a cool bird that may or may not be angry. This week's bird is the shoebill. Standing up to 5 feet tall, this large, gray, stilt-legged wading bird can be found in shallow freshwater marshes in Central Africa. Once categorized as storks, the shoebill was placed into its own family after being discovered to be more closely related to pelicans. The shoebill gets its name from its enormous beak, up to a foot long and several inches wide, that is reminiscent in shape of a Dutch clog. They use their beak to incredible effect, catching their primary prey item fish, but have also been known to eat frogs, water snakes, and even baby crocodiles. Shoebills are monogamous despite being primarily solitary, and though they typically lay 2 eggs, the chick that hatches second is often outcompeted for resources from the parents by the first, older and stronger chick. But are they angry? On a scale of 1 to angry, we rate the shoebill as stone face.
This is Wild Green Streams. I'm Rhett.
I'm Curtis.
And with us today is PhD student at the University of Washington, Sarah Teman. Sarah, welcome.
Hi, Rhett and Curtis. It's great to be here.
Sarah does research on all kinds of large marine mammals, and she's here today to talk about a paper she came out with last year about strange behaviors in the orcas and the southern resident killer whale population off the coast of Canada and Washington. Sarah, do you want to tell us a little bit about your study?
Yeah. Thanks for being interested in this. I know that my collaborators and co-authors, we were all super jazzed about this. So it was exciting that people who may not have traditionally been whale people were also picking up on it. But I guess just to give a little bit of background for the study, I'll just talk about killer whales generally for a second. So killer whales are the largest species of dolphin, which are also whales. I know that's a hot point of contention.
All dolphins are whales. Not all whales are dolphins. That's how I phrase it.
Exactly, yeah. And if you want to see a lot of wrong answers to that, just look at any Facebook comment section for any whale video ever. People will be fighting about which is the case. But killer whales, yeah, they are largest species of dolphin and they're found around the world. And here in the North Pacific, we have 3 ecotypes of killer whales. And an ecotype is a specific group of killer whale that they're different genetically, behaviorally, morphologically, and what they eat. So they're like different, not subspecies, but it might become that eventually. It wouldn't be surprising if genetic analyses in the future actually do designate them as formally different subspecies. But we have 3 ecotypes of killer whales here in the North Pacific. So we have the resident ecotype, and the resident ecotype, they mostly eat fish, if not almost primarily salmon. And so here in the Salish Sea, which is the sea that surrounds or is within the enclosed area of British Columbia and Washington State, we have the southern resident killer whales, which they love to eat salmon, mostly Chinook salmon. And there's only about 75 of them left because of a lot of different things. One of them being the captures that happened for the aquarium industry back in the 60s and 70s that really took a blow to their population size. But now the reason that they aren't really bouncing back like maybe their northern resident cousins, which are another type of resident killer whale that lives a little farther north, is because the southern residents are kind of compounded by a bunch of different threats. So they are suffering from lack of prey, so available Chinook salmon that they love to eat. They're not finding enough food. They're suffering from lots of noise from marine traffic in the Salish Sea. And then lastly, they're dealing with contaminants. So things that bioaccumulate in their tissues and then kind of just go on to cause a whole host of negative, nasty health effects. And then all of that is further exacerbated by an inbreeding depression. So you have a small population that already isn't doing well. It kind of is this little vortex where it gets harder and harder to break out of that inbreeding depression, which is something that the southern residents are experiencing. The other 2 killer whale ecotypes that we have in the North Pacific are the transient or Biggs killer whales and the offshore killer whales. And the transient Biggs killer whales, named after the late Michael Bigg, who was a prominent killer whale researcher. The transients eat marine mammals. So they're very different from the southern residents who mostly eat fish. Transients love to eat marine mammals, which include seals and porpoises, whales, other whales in other parts of their range. And then we have the offshore killer whales, which like to eat sharks. And they're not seen as much here in the Salish Sea. They're found usually quite a distance away from shore. So here in the Salish Sea, we're dealing with the southern resident killer whales and the Biggs killer whales. And even though they live in the same area, they really don't like to interact. And what's interesting is that you would think that the mammal-eating killer whales would be the ones that are kind of maybe more likely to be aggressive or antagonistic, but it's actually the opposite. The southern residents, the fish eaters, when they see the transients or the big killer whales, they'll kind of chase them out of the area. And that is something that I've always found really interesting and kind of opposite of my expectations. So I like to share that.
That is interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So the two groups, they don't interbreed, they don't interact. They have totally separate communication styles. The southern residents are made up of 3 pods, J, K, and L pods, and they all interbreed. And then the big killer whales have a bunch of different pods that go by like crazy long alphanumeric designations that I definitely do not have memorized. Something that I also think is really interesting with regard to like how these two ecotypes are different is how they communicate. So the southern residents are super chatty, even within the 3 pods. They all have kind of different dialects. I think I heard K-pod described as being more, they sound more like cat-like in their acoustic vocalizations, which is something that I won't try to mimic, but there are these little things that researchers can use to differentiate which pod is speaking. Whereas the transient killer whales, they are mostly silent when they're hunting. And it makes sense why they would be like that, because they're hunting marine mammals who can hear them. And so they would probably want to stay quiet while they're traversing the Salish Sea looking for some tasty, blubbery snacks. But once they make a kill, they are super loud, super playful. They're breaching, jumping. It almost seems like a big celebration. So the transient killer whales live this lifestyle that I like to think of as quiet, 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 hunt, hunt, hunt. Yay, we made a hunt. Let's celebrate. Let's play. Big splashes around. And then back to being quiet. We're moving on. We're going to go find another kill. And so at least that's just how I've seen it in the field work that I've done. But the southern residents are quite chatty all the time. There are hydrophones that are placed all over in the Salish Sea, and there's lots of different groups that like to keep watch of where the whales are, and they know when the southern residents enter an area because of how vocal they are.
With these calls, would it be like a foreign language if the two groups were to, I know they avoid each other, but if they were to attempt to communicate, there's so much guesswork in this type of thing. But based on what you're describing, it's like it's language in a way, right?
I'm no acoustician, but I would consider it language. And I don't know what the right analogy would be in terms of, is it a different language? Can they understand each other?
Mhm.
I won't guess on that, but it's super interesting.
Why do they eat different kinds of food?
Why? I guess because they evolved that way hundreds of thousands of years ago.
Mhm.
Like why that initially happened, I don't know. And it might have had to do with what was available at the time and how the different ecotypes decided to specialize and what maximized their fitness. And so what's super interesting about this paper is that these southern residents, which mainly eat salmon and are declining, are still able to catch and even kill porpoises, yet they won't eat them.
That's really strange. And you had some really interesting ideas in the paper for why that might be.
It's almost a little frustrating that this population that you really want to recover is, you're like, why can't you just eat this? Why can't you just do what we all know would be good for you? But the truth is it's just not in their culture. They didn't evolve that way. And digestively, it probably wouldn't be fun for them. I imagine that eating a porpoise when you are maybe a pescatarian, so to say, would wreak havoc intestinally. I'd be remiss to not mention Dr. Deborah Giles, who is the lead scientist for Wild Orca, which is a nonprofit based on San Juan Island in Washington, working to study and conserve the southern resident killer whales. And so she goes by Giles, so that's how I'll refer to her. But Giles has been studying the southern residents for decades, and she first saw this porpoise harassment behavior in the early thousands. And so she was like super perplexed by this because she's only known the killer whales to eat salmon. And the first time that she saw it was like, what's going on? She reached out to a whole bunch of scientists, especially a lot are on San Juan Island. There's a lot of killer whale researchers there. So she collaborated with different scientists, and they were kind of able to pool together all their observations of this behavior over the last few decades. Giles has been studying this for probably since the early 2000s. And she approached me in 2020 around. Her and my former boss, Dr. Joe Gatos at the Sea Doc Society, which is where I worked before grad school, they were really interested in kind of summarizing all these findings of porpoise harassment over the years. And so that's when we all three of us got together and we decided to write a paper on it. And in doing this and doing the analyses, we found these really interesting things, like the fact that this has probably been transmitted across cultures and down matrilines, and some pods did it more in the beginning, but then over time, all the pods will do this behavior. So I think that this project was a deeply collaborative study that we were all able to put our heads together and work on. And without everybody, there's a ton of authors on the paper, and without everybody's contribution, it really wouldn't have been what it is. We have three main hypotheses why the Southern residents do what they do. And just to preface this, we'll never truly know what the real reason is. We can only make educated guesses or hypotheses about why we think that they're doing this. But our hypotheses are based in the data, and we use that to inform our overall interpretation of these behaviors. And so our first interpretation of the behavior is that it's a form of play. Killer whales, like other dolphins, are known to be very playful, if you will allow me to anthropomorphize. They're super curious animals, highly intelligent. They'll find something that is novel in their environment, and they will definitely play around with it. The Southern residents are also known to do a behavior that's called kelping, which is just they get some kelp on their dorsal fins, which are the big fins on their back, and they swim around with it and seem to enjoy doing that.
Was the population that had the salmon hat trend?
That is the Southern residents, the same population. So they had this trend in 1987 where the Southern residents would kill a Chinook salmon, so their main prey, and then they would just wear the salmon on top of their head and carry it around and kind of flaunt it like, hey, look what I've got. And then one pod started doing it, the other pod saw it, they started doing it. And so soon it just spread within the population.
It's an Orca meme.
Yeah, it was the first Orca meme, was the salmon hat trend. And then it interestingly just stopped after that summer. None of the pods were seen carrying the salmon anymore. So it was like a super live fast, die hard trend that I guess they just got bored with.
That's just like in the group. We get trends blowing through, and a couple weeks would be a long time there, actually. They're in and they're out.
Yeah, it was the first crop, frogs and cranberries.
That's right.
Killer whales did it first.
Salmon and seaweed, it must be summer.
Salmon and hats, it must be cultural transmission?
We'll workshop it.
It's called fashion. Look it up.
So they have these culturally transmitted, sort of like a meme, but the orcas in these populations especially will learn from each other, and they seem to have a sort of a culture, and they have almost fads that go through. So they're probably learning from each other to play in this way.
Yeah, exactly. It's probably transmitted between whales by social observation. So literally watch and learn, kid. Like, watch me hunt this porpoise, and then, all right, mom, I'll do that too. So we think that this was transmitted across pods. So again, those three pods, J, K, and L, but not only across pods, but down matrilines. And so matrilines are like the most cohesive social unit of resident killer whale society. So it's basically the maternal lineage of a killer whale line that stays together for life. And so this is different than in other killer whale populations, where a lot of times female offspring will stay with mom, but males will disperse. For the resident killer whales, both sexes seem to stay with mom for life. And there's a lot of different hypotheses as to why that might be. And it does contribute when you have an inbreeding depression, all that's going on. The three pods do interbreed, and so it's not a solely within pod kind of thing. But knowing that they aren't really leaving their natal group much, it does limit the amount of other contact they would have.
That's really interesting that social structure exists in some groups of killer whales, but not others.
Yeah, I'd have to look more into like other killer whale ecotype social structures. I'm sure that matrilines are still prominent in a lot of them, but the Southern residents are really good at sticking with what they know.
Right.
And that's definitely seen evident in how they will not waver from eating salmon, even though they are literally dangling porpoises in front of their face that theoretically would provide nutritional value, but they won't eat it.
And a lot of the time they're about
strange.
the same size as the salmon that they would eat, right? Like the ones that they're actually going after.
Yeah. And so that actually is a great point of our other hypothesis, which is that this behavior is a form of hunting practice, because the Chinook salmon, an adult Chinook salmon is about the same size as a young harbor porpoise. And so it kind of checks out that maybe killer whales, the Southern residents, are using these harbor porpoises as a way to practice hunting. That said, they do go after adult harbor porpoises at times. It just kind of adds to our toolbox of thinking about what are all the data points that lead us to think about one hypothesis versus the other hypothesis. And as we say in the paper, it's probably a combination of multiple things, and this behavior probably means different things for different whales. Like porpoise harassment for a young killer whale would probably make me think it's more play/hunting practice, but if it's a really old killer whale, they might not need hunting practice as much, unless it's, say, an adult female with a calf who is then teaching her calf, this is how you hunt a salmon. It definitely depends on the demographic that's doing it. And I think our third hypothesis is also super interesting. Our third hypothesis as to why the southern residents harass porpoises is that it might actually be a form of mismothering behavior. And so what that means is that reproductive age killer whales might view porpoises in some way akin to them. And it's kind of like the situation where the lion adopts the baby gazelle and carries it around for a bit. And usually people look at this as, oh, that's so sweet and cute and the animal's going to survive. But it often doesn't end well for the adoptee. There have been lots of other cases of whale or dolphin species kind of kidnapping youngsters from other populations. Most of the time, that individual does not end up making it, probably because of different energetic demands, such as lactation or things that may impact a youngster's growth and development. But one of the reasons that we kind of think that southern residents display this behavior is because of how seemingly tender they can be towards the porpoises, in contrast to other interactions with porpoises where sometimes other age groups will be like ramming the porpoise or throwing it out of the water or punting it or slapping it with their tail. There are other southern residents that will like swim with the porpoise in what we call echelon position, which is like mom and calf position. So they swim together, or the killer whale seems to be engaging in a behavior with the porpoise that like you would think it was its own calf. And so that's why we're kind of also proposing this hypothesis that this behavior can mean different things for different groups and depending on who is doing it in the southern resident population.
So those are really interesting different hypotheses, and it's crazy that this animal has such complexity that it's like play and teaching and potentially misplaced adoption are like such wildly different ideas, and like it's just kind of mind-blowing.
Yeah, that you put it beautifully. Like they are so no, I'm being very sincere when I say that, because they do this range of different behaviors and we're kind of just here like scratching our heads like, what does it all mean? Like to be, if
It's
only we
like,
could
do they
be
even know what it means? Like, again, we're just limited by our human minds, but like I honestly wonder, do they even know what they're doing, or is it just some instinct that's so subconscious? Or I mean, is it possibly like a holdover of like this was a population that once ate porpoises and that's still ingrained in them, even though their diet has been replaced with salmon?
There's no evidence to suggest, as far as I'm aware, that they once ate porpoises. So I don't think that it's a holdover of anything. What we don't know is how long they have really been doing this behavior. Our first observation of it, or our first written record, was in 1962, but this may have been something that happened on and off, for centuries and whatnot. But just based on what we're limited to knowing as people, it's unsure if maybe this has, maybe porpoise harassment 100 years ago, 200 years ago was like super high rates, and then it kind of dies down and then it gets picked back up again. And so these like longitudinal studies are important because we can track those over time, but we do consider 1962 as our starting point, just from what we know as scientists.
That's our show. Thanks for listening. You can support the show on patreon.com/wildgreenmemes. That's memes with an M. We'll send you cool stuff in the mail, and sometimes we put the names of our patrons at the end of the episodes. Until next time, I'm Rhett.
I'm Curtis.
I'm Sarah.
And happy Year of the Raccoon.